It's very unusual. I wonder what it looks like down there. I have to look at my own stuff.
That's why we're sitting back a little bit.
Yeah. It's like, when people go to the IMAX theater, I have to sit in the back too. Otherwise, I'm crooking my neck up and it's too much. Then I have to slouch down. Then it hurts my back. Yeah, okay, that works. Words showed up pretty good. The drop shadow does wonders.
We're working on change.
For what? Oh, this is great. No, this is good. I like it. Very nice. All right, let's get started. Is everything all right to go? Michael, John, we're ready to go? Okay. All right. Let's open with a word of prayer, shall we? Dear Heavenly Father, thank you so much for the good food. Wow. And thank you for the rain, Lord. The farmers need it. And thank you that the fall weather is coming. Bless everyone here, Lord. And those who are still coming, please keep them safe on the road. Bless us now. And Lord, give us knowledge and understanding, wisdom and discernment, and as we go through this, because this is not easy to follow. And I pray that you would bless each one here. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, America's Christian nation debate. Are we a Christian nation? That's a good question to ask. Some people have come along and they've said, well, if we're a Christian nation, then we should only have Christian presidents in office. And believe it or not, that's exactly what has happened. There was a survey that was conducted a number of years ago, and who would they accept as a president? And there was a survey on whether blacks would be accepted as presidents, a woman, Catholics, Hispanics, Jewish people, Mormons, gay or lesbian, Muslim, atheist, and this is a Gallup poll. This Gallup poll was taken between June 7 and June 10th, 2012. Can you guess what the percentages were? They were quite revealing. A black person? Yes, 96% of Americans said that having a black as a president is very acceptable. Okay? In fact, they received the least amount of disapproval of any of the categories I just mentioned, believe it or not. And of course, this was taken during the time of the presidency of Barack Obama. Now, if this poll had been taken before the presidency of Barack Obama, it might have been lower, but we don't know that, okay? So that kind of skews this percentage a bit, okay? Because we all want the president to succeed, at least many want him to succeed. I shouldn't say all. All right? A Catholic. The next category was a woman. 95% said yes. 5% said no. Catholic, 94% said yes. Man, can you imagine where we've come from since John F. Kennedy? That's quite an amazing number when you think about it. I mean, I remember when Protestants all over, including Seventh-day Adventists, the hue and the cry was, JFK, John F. Kennedy, is a Catholic, therefore he's going to answer to the Pope, and we're going to have Catholic law. Okay? That was a big issue back then. In fact, I would like to transition there first. John F. Kennedy is probably still, most people don't realize this, but to a political science and historian and constitutional scholar and presidential historian that I am, one of the things that a lot of people don't realize is how the political paradigms shifted during the age of Kennedy and Nixon. The 1960 election did more to shift the political landscape in the United States since the time of the demise of the Federalist Party during the founding, the demise of the Whig Party during the time of Lincoln, okay, especially after the Mexican-American War. We've gone through several shifts and changes politically in our country's history, and a lot of people don't realize that. So there was a seismic shift that took place in the time of the election of 1960. John F. Kennedy was a liberal Democrat from the Northeast. Okay? The Democratic Party was mostly dominated by the Southern conservatives, the Dixiecrats, okay? And forgive me, the bigoted South, all right? But it's true. And so, I mean, going clear back to the Civil War and their values, which was states' rights to the extreme, the idea that states don't have to answer to the federal government, that states are sovereign over the federal government. That's been a Confederate point of view from eons, going clear back to Thomas Jefferson's Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. Okay? So, and also the idea that we believe economically of austerity without raising revenue. In other words, if you're going to restore the economy, just don't tax anybody. That's the only way. Well, all that does is basically reward the wealthy and give very little to those who have little to begin with. And so that has always enriched the wealthy, left the countryside and the infrastructure into basically slum-like areas, gravel roads if that, dirt roads, mud roads, no real infrastructure except in the cities. So, and I've seen that throughout the South. The South is very much like that in many places still to this day. And you go up into the north, the Midwest, you go to the west, man, it's like night and day difference. It's like you're going back to another world when you go to the South. And so that was always the mindset. And so your Southern Baptists, God bless them. I went to Baylor University, a Baptist university, very good people. Southern Methodists in the Bible Belt had a real hard time with Kennedy being their standard bearer, a Catholic from the Northeast, from Massachusetts, and a liberal. And to top it all off, the third thing was he believed in civil rights. He embraced Martin Luther King. That was a huge black eye to Kennedy. In the 1960 presidential election, John F. Kennedy lost nearly the entire South in the election. Lost it to Nixon. That began the dance between the Christian right, okay, and the evangelical right and the Republican Party. It was a huge deal in the South. If you go back to the Civil War during the time of Lincoln, it was the anti-slavery abolitionist North and Northeast that represented the Christian right of that day. Okay? They were anti-slavery. It was very much of a moral issue. The South, they defended slavery even using the Bible. Okay? Used the book of Philemon to defend the institution of slavery. Okay? Out of context, mind you. But nevertheless, that's what they used. And so both sides had their Christian rights, so to speak. And so you had to pick and choose which one you wanted. Well, Lincoln, of course, played to his base, and of course, he produced the Emancipation Proclamation Act, and later became the law with the 13th Amendment after he died, passed Congress. But the point is with with Kennedy and Nixon is that with that began this shift, because with that little dance after Nixon, it took many years, but with the emergence of Ronald Reagan, by the end of his second term, the entire South went from being nearly 70% Democrat, to all of a sudden overnight being 70%, nearly 70% Republican. And into the Republican Party came the Confederate philosophy, which has taken over the Republican Party. And the party of Lincoln, the party of civil rights, which has, in my opinion, gone too far in some respects, okay, has pretty much taken over the Democratic Party, the party of the North, the East, and the West Coast. If you look at the demographics, you look at the dynamics, that is what's happened. an extreme political paradigm shift has taken place, and most people don't realize it. They have no clue. They have no understanding of where we're at in terms of values and who represents what. I'm a Lincoln Republican, and I'll leave it there. My wife is a diehard Democrat, all right? And sometimes we don't see eye to eye, but most of the time we do, because we're both church-state separationists. And we believe in the Bible, our prophetic message, and our prophetic message guides what we see politically. If they're not pro-separation of church and state, I can't vote for that person, to be honest with you. I just can't. All right? That's the bottom line. That's where my vote goes. And that's what we're supposed to do. Hold back the four winds of strife the best we can. Even though it's inevitable that the worst will happen, we must do everything we can to hold back the four winds of strife. If they are people who will join church and state and vow to do so, and it's very obvious, then let that be your warning signal. Don't adhere to your prejudices. Again, go with your biblical mandate for what's right. Do we want church and state united? Do we want the church to control the state? By the way, in case you don't know the definition of the prophetic image to the beast, I challenge you with this one reference. I'm going to look it up here. But it's Great Controversy, page 443. You ready for this? Great Controversy 443. I didn't read it to you today, but I'm going to now. All right? Not getting much of a signal here. Is your internet good here? Huh. Sanctuary. Well, let me just reboot and let's see what comes up. Sometimes I just need to reboot, and that's all it is. So let me do that. I'll come back to that. But back to our survey. Hispanics, 92% said yes. Catholic, 94%. Jewish, 91%. Mormons, 80% said yes. And at that time, Mitt Romney was running for president in 2012. Gay or lesbian, 68%. That's where you have your dramatic drop. Then Muslims, 58%. And atheists, 54% said yes. There was a debate in the Constitutional Convention as to whether an atheist could be elected president. And there were some who believed they shouldn't be, and there should be a Christian oath put before each one running for president or for any public office. And that's when Charles Pinckney, representative senator from South Carolina, said no, there should be no religious tests or oath for public office. So that got into Article 6, Section 3 of the Constitution. It says no religious test or office shall be required to hold a public office. And so that was their answer. They anticipated that, yes, even an atheist could become president. Okay, now let's see what happens here. Yeah. You got it? Really? Seriously? What's wrong with mine? I'm not happy with mine. You're telling me I have AT&T. I mean, I have AT&T, and I have. Wow. Oh, here. Wait a minute. Here's my problem. Oh, I just needed to type in the letters. It's just me, my foolishness. I got it. Here, I'm good. I was just losing my mind here. All right. Great Controversy 443. When the early church became corrupted by departing from the simplicity of the gospel and accepting heathen rites and customs, she lost the spirit and power of God. And in order to control the consciences of the people, she sought the support of the secular power. The result was the papacy, a church that controlled the power of the state and employed it to further her own ends, especially for the punishment of heresy. Now listen to this. In order for the United States to form an image of the beast of Revelation 13, okay, verses 11 to 15, that image to the beast. Now we know what the beast is, Vatican, okay, the Holy See, the papacy. The image was to be like the papacy of old, except here in the United States. Did you get that? In order for the United States, our beloved country, to form an image of the beast, or an image of the likeness of the beast, where popes manipulated, dominated, and controlled the will of emperors and kings, the same thing will happen in the future here in the United States. Here's what it says again. In order for the United States to form an image of the beast, the religious power or powers must so control the civil government that the authority of the state will also be employed by the church to accomplish her own ends. Did you get that? And later, on page 444, she talks about a coming together of Protestants uniting and Catholics uniting together. Okay? That doesn't sound like today's interfaith left, does it? Sounds like the religious right of today, evangelicals and Catholics uniting. She didn't envision the interfaith left that is making up the international arena, which then circles the wagons around the United States and starts to push for a doctrine of peaceful coexistence, okay, which we talked about in the sermon. But again, I want to repeat, in order for the United States, our country, to form an image of the beast, or an image in the likeness of the Holy Roman Empire, the religious power must so control the civil government that the authority of the state will also be employed by the church to accomplish her own ends. Notice she doesn't say the secular power must so control the civil government. Does she say that? She doesn't say the secular humanist power must so control the civil government. Does she say that? She doesn't say the socialist power must so control the civil government, does she? She doesn't say the communist power must so control the civil government, does she? No. What does she say? What should we be most concerned about and look for prophetically? She says, in order for the United States to form an image of the beast, the religious power must so control the civil government. Now, again, in context, you read pages 444 clear over to 450, it's in context of Protestants uniting and Catholics joining them. Okay? It's a combined force in the United States that brings about the image to the beast. All right? So, remember, the image is not, some people say, well, the image is Sunday laws. Well, it's not initially. There's something that brings that about in the future. It has to be not only a uniting of church and state, but where the churches or religious power controls the civil government. When the religious powers start to control the civil government, whether they're controlling the Supreme Court, whether they're controlling the presidencies through some puppet who they've got, you know, willing to confess their sins and lay it all on the line and say, yeah, okay, I'll be your man, whatever it takes. It reminds me of Stefan the Great in Romania, or Vlad Dracula in Romania, where they basically paid the Orthodox Church. I mean, they literally, to remission of their sins, they built all these cathedrals all across Romania, but continued to do what they wanted to do. Okay? And they did the bidding of the church, but they were as pagan as ever. Okay? They continued their paganism. And it just reminds me of people like that. And that seems like where we're at. Somebody willing to sell their soul for political power and for the religious right to get everything they want. And that's what's happening right now. But nobody's paying attention to that. Nobody. And it's sad. Okay? So, I wanted to share that with you first. So, now I'm going to go rapidly. I'm not going to go so slow right now. What I'm going to do next is fairly rapid. I'm sorry, I'm fumbling around here. Here we go. Did the constitutional founders, I ask, intend the United States to be a Christian nation by law? Did they intend to prevent only the establishment of a national church? How far did they intend to reject medieval European standards of church and state? I think we've answered that in a way because of our Protestant heritage which the founders had themselves? Does history mean anything to us anymore? The answer to these questions are critical towards understanding the church's true prophetic mission in the United States of America. Are we betraying that mission by aiding and abetting forces that will not only unite church and state, but cause them to control the state? Now we say on the other ditch is secular humanism and atheism. Remember how the pendulum swings. I've always said, in fact, John Meacham, the presidential historian that you see on TV a lot, he says that the United States is largely a center-right nation. It will never fully swing to the left. Never. It will always perceive to be correcting itself and swing either to the center-right in moderation or swing to the far right, which we've only seen a few times. But he says the way it's going right now, it's swinging to the far right and it may be permanent. And that's what scares me. Yes, there's a time for a correction, a time for America to have a reckoning towards morals. But, and let me give you the illustration for that. It's right here. It's pretty basic. You've seen the two tables of the law of God. Even Thomas Jefferson, and I'm not sure I'll have the time to read a letter that he wrote to a Reverend James Fishback in 1820. But he wrote a letter in regard to the law of God. And Thomas Jefferson understood what the law of God was all about. The first table of the law of God were acts of loyalty, worship, and devotion, okay, to God and to God alone. And then the second table was to love your neighbor as yourself, right? But the first table was our distinct relationship with God that is so sacred that no man, no state, represented by the second table, has a right to interfere with. So therefore, that's why I would be against government-mandated prayer in public schools. All right? Why would I be against it? Because it would be the state telling me how to worship, when to worship, when to worship, why to worship, who to worship, and that would be a violation of my conscience under the first table of the law of God, which is not man's business. All right? No man, no state has a right to interfere. Reminds me of the text in Mark chapter 2, verses 27 28, where Jesus said the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. Okay, what does that mean? It means that man, it's a gift given strictly by God. It's a gift of God to have the Sabbath. It's not meant for the state to bestow the Sabbath upon us, or for man to bestow upon us the Sabbath, or to prescribe the Sabbath. In other words, it's not man's gift to give it to you, neither is it man's duty to prescribe it or make it law. Okay? That's not his jurisdiction. Neither is it for them to take away or attempt to take away your Sabbath. In other words, it's not made for man. That's what Jesus is saying there. It's not man-made. It's God-made. It's a God gift. Okay? That's what verse 27 of Mark 2 says. All right? So therefore, it says, verse 28, the Sabbath was made for man as a gift from God. So, the two tables of the law of God are very clear. Then you have the second table of the law of God, man's relationship with man. Now, in a democratic republic, man's relationship with man allows man to tell man or the state what morals is good and what morals are bad. I remind people, again, I tell you, I'm an equal opportunity offender, so here I go. The fifth commandment doesn't say, honor thy father and thy father, does it? It doesn't say, honor thy mother and thy mother, does it? Huh? No? Some people say, oh, I'm stretching that, you know. I'm really stretching that. Am I really? No. The whole fifth commandment is about what? It's about the family. Okay? And it's about it's about that relationship. So it says, honor thy father and thy mother, the family unit. That's what it's about. God-given family unit. Okay? Honor your father and your mother, that thy days may be long upon the land which the Lord your God is giving you, or has given you. Okay? So, it's not about honoring your father and your mother. That's not the primary purpose of the commandment. The primary purpose, the larger big picture of the message, is the family unit that God ordained. Okay? So, I think we have a right as Christians to say, okay, yeah, I'm for keeping church and state separate, but, you know, like I did when I testified at the Washington legislature and the Senate and the House, hey, I'm sorry, I have to go against Governor Gregoire's bill, Christine Gregoire, the governor, against her bill to legalize same-sex marriage. I knew that it would get passed, but representing the church, I decided, in fact, the conference presidency didn't ask me to do it. I left messages in all their phones and never got a call back except for one, and that was, what's his face? Our former General Conference president's son. Come on. Oh, who was our General Conference's presidents before? No, Falkenberg, thank you. Elder Falkenberg Jr., Robert Falkenberg Jr., who's over in China. He was our Upper Columbia Conference president in Spokane. And he called me and says, yes, by all means. Absolutely. So I did. I testified against both bills, both in the House and the Senate. And I'm glad I did. I says, I want to thank the sponsor who was gay, Senate sponsor, Jamie Peterson. And he's Catholic, and brought up his two darling little children, son and daughter, with his partner. They testified, the lead testimony, and how they were a family unit, okay? They were a happy family unit. Well, he's a Catholic, and he's very much interested in a Workplace Religious Freedom Act in Washington. So, again, strange bedfellows, but God is good. You know, God can use people like that. So, anyway, I thanked him for providing really strong exemption language, I mean bulletproof exemption language against religious institutions, clergy, teachers, you know, any religious entity. And so I thanked him for that. And then I went on with my testimony of why I couldn't back up the bill. And on either side of me were hellfire-breathing preachers. You are all going to hell, and you all ought to be ashamed of yourself, and you're all damned, you know. And oh man, it's like, thank you. They were relieved to hear from me, you know. So no, seriously. I mean, it's like, friends, we have to be sound. We have to be, you know, come across as reasonable, right? So, you know, it's the law of the land. So back the law of the land, but shore up our institutions so that we can protect our institutions to hire the people that will follow our mission, right? That's the bottom line. They have their rights, respect their rights. You know, Jesus was inclusive. And I know this may blow you away, and you might all want to leave and leave. That's fine. I'll speak to one person if I have to. But, you know, about the bakery stuff. I want to tell you something. If I was a cake baker, and I think this is what Jesus would do. I may be wrong. You may call me wrong. That's fine. We may differ. But I would not only bake the cake, I would deliver the cake. I would even attend their wedding. Okay? Because that's what Jesus would do. All right? Seriously. He was accused of eating and drinking with wine bibbers. All right? Tax collectors. All right? Eating with whores. Okay? Was he inclusive or exclusive? Was he pharisaical? In the name of protecting and defending their rights? No. He was inclusive. Seventh-day Adventist business people have it in their power to witness to these people. Is that condoning their wedding by going to the wedding? You know, as long as they know, and this has been very clear for me, as long as they know that you object to their lifestyle and you object to their choice, but you're honoring their choice. You're honoring the Constitution and their right to do so. But as long as they know that, hey, I don't agree with your marriage, I don't believe it's biblical, don't be afraid to say that. But say, I'm here to honor your choice. I don't agree with it, but I'm here to honor your choice. You know, and that really makes a difference with them, big time. They just say, that's fair enough, that's good, that's reasonable. We need to be reasonable people, my friends. We need to be reasonable people. So, in regard to the law of God, are we a Christian nation by law? No. Do we have a right to speak up? Yes. And I look at the rest of those 10 commandments, I look at them and I say to myself, you know, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not steal. You shall not commit adultery. And some people say, oh, you shall not murder. Well, you can't legislate morality. When a group of people get together and sign a petition to make sure there's a stop sign in that street because so many people have gotten killed, all right, isn't that legislating morality? You bet it is. My friends, we have to be reasonable about such things, all right? There is a time to legislate morality. Didn't Ellen White stand up for, wasn't she anti-slavery? She was an abolitionist. She believed in dress reform. She believed in prohibition. She was one of the national spokesperson against alcohol. All right? It's true. Read about it. It's pretty significant. And there's some evidence to suggest she was for the women's suffrage movement, although we have no strong evidence for that. But it seems like she gave every indication she was for it. All right? So those are pretty significant things. Did you know Ellen White was probably the most politically active person in our church's history? She wasn't afraid. Why are we? All right? So, hey, become like me. Become an equal opportunity offender. It's a good way to go. People respect you for it. It's true. They may disagree with you, but hey, they'll say, at least you make a reasonable argument. That's what matters. Stand on your own 2 feet. Speak up. We need more people to speak up. Amen? That's right. So, anyway, see people say, well, but you can't legislate adultery against adultery. I says, well, there's divorce courts. There's referees. They're called judges. What about murder? Same thing. You know, murder somebody, you pay the price for it. That's legislating morality. Yeah? Don't tell me that you can't legislate morality. We do it all the time. So man's relationship with man, man has a right to regulate, right? Correct? But when it comes to the first 4 commandments, acts of loyalty, worship, and devotion, no man, no state has any right whatsoever. Amen? That's called freedom of conscience and religious freedom. Okay? Thought we'd be clear on that. And by the way, that letter to Reverend James Fishback, if you want a copy of it, I have it right here. It's right here. And it's very clear. And it's actually quite comical reading. It's amazing. He had a sense of humor, believe it or not. All right. Seventh-day Adventist perspective. The founders of the nation, Ellen G. White said, on page 442 of the Great Controversy, said, the founders of the nation wisely sought to guard against the employment of secular power on the part of who? On the part of the church. Now, church is just general. That is, religious powers. With its inevitable result, intolerance and persecution. That's a general principle. The church's mission has always been to keep church and state separate so that religious freedom and thus its gospel mission can thrive to bless others. Amen? It does not, as mere bystanders, apathetically accept the prophetic inevitability of intolerance and persecution. Instead, it believes in vigorously championing the equal constitutional guarantee of civil and religious freedom for all individuals and not just Seventh-day Adventists. Amen? That's the purpose. Otherwise, we have no mission, no ministry. This is the Declaration of Principles from Liberty Magazine that's published in there every issue. Has been since the late 1960s. Roland Hegstad wrote this. He just passed away. In his home, he had several homes, but Silver Spring, Maryland, his other home was his boyhood home. Was in. He actually grew up in Spokane at first, but he spent most of his years in Vancouver, Washington, near Portland, Oregon, is where he grew up. He wrote this: the God-given right of religious liberty is best exercised when church and state are separate. Amen? Government is God's agency to protect individual rights and to conduct civil affairs. In exercising these responsibilities, officials are entitled to respect and cooperation. Religious liberty entails freedom of conscience, to worship or not to worship, to profess, practice, and promulgate religious beliefs, or to change them. In exercising these rights, however, one must respect the equivalent rights of all others. Attempts to unite church and state are opposed to the interests of each, subversive of human rights, and potentially persecuting in character. To oppose union lawfully and honorably is not only the citizen's duty, but the essence of the golden rule, to treat others as one wishes to be treated. And that includes the gay community. Treaty of Tripoli. Are we a Christian nation? Did the founders intend our nation to be Christian? Well, here's the first statement on it after the Constitution was ratified. It was in 1796. It was a draft, a Treaty of Tripoli that was drafted by the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, or its equivalent designation in those days, in cooperation with President George Washington in 1796, and then signed by President John Adams in 1797. And it says this: the government of the United States in America is not, in any sense, founded on the Christian religion. Did you get that? Yeah, it's true. The Constitution reflects our founders' views of a secular government protecting the freedom of any belief or unbelief. The historian Robert Middlecoff observed, the idea that the Constitution expressed a moral view seems absurd. There were no genuine evangelicals in the convention, and there were no heated declarations of Christian piety. But are we a Christian nation? Demographically, historically, culturally, constitutionally, what are we? Well, this is what's interesting. If I ask you that question, are we a Christian nation, be careful how you answer that. Because demographically, even though we're a pluralistic nation of many religions, Christianity dominates. And so, demographically, we are a Christian nation. Okay? We are. That's a fact. Going back to the days of the Puritans. Okay? Now, that number of professed Christians has dropped. Back years ago, when I say years ago, it was actually 1985, a Gallup poll was taken, and 94% of Americans profess to be Christian at one level or another, from the highest fundamentalist level down to the lowest secular humanist level. Yes, there are Christians who are very secular and very humanist, and so that's where they did it. So they did the scale. Okay? Then in 1995, two surveys came out. One was a Newsweek survey, and another one was from Baylor University, my alma mater. And they said that it had dropped down to 75%, from 94% clear down to 75%. Now, it's just barely above 60%, the number of professed Christians. It's gone way down. And that's because I don't know if it's the X or Y generation, I'm not sure which one we're in, but they have largely left institutionalized church. It's a fact. I mean, it's happening all around the world. And so we've gone way down in terms of profession of Christianity in the United States. More and more young people are just neither. They don't want to be anything. They don't want to answer to any tune or any bell or anything. Okay? And so that's an interesting phenomenon that we're dealing with. So, but demographically, even if it's over 60%, which they say it is, we're still technically a Christian nation demographically. Historically, yes. Culturally, yes. The Puritan work ethic, okay. Good days, wages, work, hard work, family, and so on. It's good. Good citizenship. Culturally, yes, we are a Christian nation. Constitutionally, why not? It's very simple. We have, there's, and don't read that Madison quote yet, let's just go back to that. There's another slide, actually. Let me go to that slide. Here, we're going to do something here. Let me leave this here. I'm going to go somewhere. Going back to my old lecture here. Working in my own armor here. There we go. All right. The constitutional founders appraised two models of history when they were crafting the Constitution. And this is the secret behind the Founding Fathers. This is the secret to their genius. I wrote an article that I've never published. I've never even submitted to anybody, but I've used it in my lectures. I haven't even taken the time to finish the article and submit it to Liberty Magazine or anywhere else. But it goes like this. It's right here. Appraising two models of history, the secret behind the Founding Fathers' genius. And it kind of stops there. But it's one of those articles you never finish. You know, I'm widely published, but I haven't finished this one, right? And I wrote this years ago. But it makes so much sense. Around 140 BC, a few nameless Greek poets who went by the pseudonym Sibyl, which in Greek means God's will, put forth a fatalistic oracle about a series of great empires succeeding one another. According to author Tom Holland, Pulitzer Prize-winning historian on the ancient Roman Republic, in his book Rubicon, The Last Years of the Roman Republic, Rome was the greatest and most baneful of all. Written at about 140 BC, what became known as Sibyl's Curse uncannily foreshadowed the Republic's rise and fall. Here's what he said. Any children in the audience? Nope, we're good. All right, this is pretty serious stuff. All right? Sibyl's oracle goes like this. This is pretty serious. I want you to, this is adult language here, so be careful. An empire will rise from beyond the western sea, white and many-headed, and its sway will be measureless, bringing ruin and terror to kings. Thank you. I didn't see that, child. Thank you. I appreciate that. Sorry, that's a pastor's son. Good move. Good move. Sorry, I guess he was sleeping. I didn't see him. They will bring despair to humanity, and then once they have succumbed to their savagery and pride, the fall of these men will be terrible indeed. They will sink into a swamp of decadence. Men will sleep with men, and boys will be pimped in brothels. Civil tumults will engulf them, and everything will fall into confusion and disorder. The world will be filled with evil, not foreign invaders, Italy, but your own sons will rape you, a brutal, interminable gang rape, punishing you, famous country, for all your many depravities, leaving you prostrated, stretched out among the burning ashes, self-slaughtered, no longer the mother of upstanding men, but rather the nurse of savage, ravening beasts. The nurse of savage, ravening beasts. Of course, an allusion to Remus and Romulus, okay? Considered the founders who were nursed to health by a she-wolf, okay? And, you know, that's their myth, okay? And that's the myth that Roman history hangs on. But basically what Tom Holland is describing here, and what through Sibyl here, quoting Sibyl, is that Rome would fall of its own weight of licentiousness, okay? Every, how should I say, every form of vice was licensed, all right? And what happened? It fell, all right, on its own weight, all right? However, according to Virgil, who wrote his book Ecloges 100 years later in 40 BC, in the very teeth of Italy's suffering, an enormous blessing would overtake the generation of iron. That is, would overtake the generation of Rome. Virgil wrote, "Now comes the crowning age foretold in the Sibyl songs. A great new cycle, bred of time." By the way, you find this in the Adventist Bible Commentary. See, these Sibyl Greek poets were considered prophets, all right, and recognized as such even by the Adventist Bible Commentary. All right, believe it or not. It's true. And they prophesied the coming of Christ. They prophesied the coming of Christianity, okay? But here's what they said. "Now comes the crowning age foretold in the Sibyl songs. A great new cycle, bred of time, begins again. Now virginal justice and the golden age returns. Now its firstborn is sent down from high heaven." Yeah, that's amazing how God works through even pagans, okay? "With the birth of this boy, the generation of iron will pass, and a generation of gold will inherit all the world." According to Sibyl, as put forth in a Greek acrostic, this was to be the coming of Ixoye, Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior, who was to be stretched out on the blessed tree. Pretty impressive. But unlike the prophecies of Daniel, I'm writing here, and Revelation, the Sibylline oracles failed to foretell of a greater misery that would follow on the heels of the ancient pagan Roman Empire and the empire of the Caesars. This was the rise of papal Rome, an apostate Christian church that transformed itself into a formidable and so-called Holy Roman Empire that usurped the power of kings and emperors and cloaked itself in robes of righteousness while persecuting and killing all those who refused to worship at its feet. Indeed, if one were to take Sibyl's oracle seriously, what was intended to be a blessing to all the world became a ravaging and murderous curse during a 1260-year time period from 538 AD to 1798 AD. The Revelator describes this as a time in which the woman, the false church, Rome, was drunk with the blood of the saints, the blood of those who bore testimony to Jesus, Revelation 17:6. Indeed, God's persecuted people were like gold tried in the fire. Only in this sense, however unintended, would Sibyl's oracle have any credible meaning. When one takes into account these two fundamental models of empirical history, Rome under both republic and empire, okay, which includes the long papal period, it is no wonder that America's constitutional founders, while admiring the amazing cultural and civic achievements of these empires, they hoped, as historian Richard Brookhiser put it recently, to avoid the failing. You get it? They didn't want the failures of the ancient Roman Republic, where licentiousness was licensed. Anybody could do anything they want. You know, in Nevada, they have a saying there where I pastored. You know, you can do anything you want. It's a big playland. But if you violate the rules, they throw you in jail and they throw away the key. They lock you up and throw away the key. You abide by the rules, but if you don't abide by the rules, they lock you up and throw away the key. They forget about you. So that's how cruel that kind of life is. And so it was the same thing, sort of the same mindset. So the secret behind the Founding Fathers was to make sure that they didn't fall into one pit, secularism run amok, right? And the other pit, a church-controlled state, Puritanism. Do you see what I'm saying? They didn't want either one. Okay? So that was the genius behind the founding. The founders. That was their genius. And we should respect that. Now, let me go back. I'm sorry, I didn't get that slide corrected last night. There we go. Okay. We're getting there. All right. So I hope you're following me because this is kind of intense stuff. I wanted to give you the background before we go any further. So James Madison, in his proposal of a Bill of Rights to the House of Representatives, he was in the first congressional session, June 8, 1789, said, "I confess that in a government modified like this of the United States, the greater danger lies rather in the abuse of the community than in the legislative body. The prescriptions in favor of liberty ought therefore to be leveled against that quarter where the greatest danger lies, namely that which possesses the highest prerogative of power. This is not found in either the executive or legislative departments," and he says later in that same speech that it's not the Supreme Court either. He says, "This is not found in either the executive or legislative departments of government, but in the body of the people operating by the majority against the minority." Thus, Thomas Jefferson influencing James Madison to turn or change his mind. He was against a Bill of Rights at the beginning and very much sided with Alexander Hamilton, who was against a Bill of Rights. But Jefferson, writing feverishly from Paris, said, "We need a Bill of Rights before we ratify the Constitution." And so in the very first Congress, after the Constitution was ratified, this was his speech before the first U.S. congressional session in June 8, 1789. We need a Bill of Rights, and here's the reason why. That the people operating by the majority against the minority, a mobocracy, cannot be allowed. Okay? James Madison's Memorial and Remonstrance, which was a remonstrance against Patrick Henry's attempt.
Google your HDMI cable. We lost your signal.
Oh. Oh, no, you haven't lost it. I just didn't turn it on the slides. That's my fault. We're fine. All right, we're fine. That's all right. We didn't lose anything. I'm the one who's not awake. The screen's correct, not me. I'm the one who's flawed. There we go. Bingo. Okay? All right. That's the quote. Read it quick. Hurry up. Okay, hurry up. Winding the tape here. Got it? You got it now? Okay. James Madison, in his Memorial and Remonstrance, which was protesting Patrick Henry's bill in the Virginia Assembly in 1776, which said, okay, we'll disestablish the Anglican Church, but we're going to make a provision available so that people in our state can determine which of their taxes they want to give to the church and teacher and pastor or clergyman of their choice. And so it was a funding assumption bill that Jefferson very much opposed, saying, well, you know what that means? That means the most powerful religion will get all the money, the lion's share of the money, and those who don't will continue to be discriminated against. And so James Madison rose up, and he protested this too, and he united all the religious minorities in Virginia to oppose Patrick Henry's bill and instead introduce the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom. In fact, what we'll discover as we go along here, the debates between Patrick Henry and Jefferson on one side and Jefferson and Madison on the other side are the debates that would eventually make it to the First Congress of 1789 when the religious freedom clauses, the Establishment and Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment, were debated. We're going to look at the original drafts. Were those handed out? Was that handed out to everybody? Is it in the other room still, in the pastor's study? Okay. That needs to be handed out. Okay? So, we will look at those drafts, and you'll be able to take those home, but those original drafts of the First Amendment, of the religion clauses of the First Amendment, gives you an idea of the actual debates that made it into both the House and the Senate in the very first Congress of 1789. On the one hand, in the House side was Madison's argument. In the Senate side, even though Patrick Henry was not a senator, his arguments got into the Senate side. And in the end, it was Patrick Henry who lost and Madison who won. Madison and Jefferson's arguments won. Jefferson wasn't in Congress either, but Madison was. Madison was on the House side, and his arguments won the day. And here's the difference. I'm going to teach you some technical language about law. Non-preferentialism means simply this. It means that you don't prefer one religion over another, but if you give equally to all religions, then it doesn't violate the Constitution. That was Patrick Henry's argument. Jefferson's argument says, no, you say you're going to give it to all equally, but in the end, it's always the churches who are the largest that receive the lion's share of the money. And because of that, that creates a sense of discrimination. And we'll see how that works out as we go along, because you're going to see that Henry's argument is actually winning today in today's courts and in legislatures, and Jefferson and Madison are losing their original argument. Okay? Even though Madison and Jefferson's arguments were correct. Okay? We'll see that. We'll see how we're actually losing our liberty from a constitutional, scholarly perspective, historical perspective. But James Madison wrote the following in Memorial and Remonstrance, number 8. He says, if religion be not within the cognizance of civil government, and this goes to the whole idea of a Christian nation by law, if religion be not within the cognizance of civil government, how can its legal establishment be necessary to civil government? It's a very logical question. What influence, in fact, have ecclesiastical establishments had on civil society, he asks. He's looking back at history now. He's looking back at Rome. He says, in some instances, they have been seen to erect a spiritual tyranny on the ruins of civil authority. Okay? The church controlling the state. And in many instances, they have been seen upholding the thrones of political tyranny. In other words, religious powers upholding brutal dictators. In no instance have they been seen the guardians of the liberties of the people. That's Madison. And Robert Alley from University of Virginia writes in his book, Without a Prayer, to whatever degree a form of religious establishment, no matter how mild, enters the Constitution through the amending process, free exercise of religion is dust. If you allow certain religions to be favored, and by the way, this is going to upset some of you. I'm just going to tell you right now, I've read several law review essays by Brett Kavanaugh, okay? And I've read numerous law review essays by Justice Scalia, okay? I've read numerous books about him and by him. And the one thing they share in common is this. They believe this firmly, okay? That states have the right, constitutionally, they believe, they would take us back even to the days of the Puritans before the constitutional founding. They believe that states have the right, like Patrick Henry wanted, to basically, although Henry disestablished the Anglican Church, so I'll back away from that, but they believe, like Judge Robert Bork used to believe, and one of the reasons why Bork was rejected, in fact, the main reason why Bork was rejected, is that they believe that states ought to favor churches through tax support. Okay? Are you in favor of that? No. All right? That's what Brett Kavanaugh believes. All right? He's written that in numerous essays. In fact, one essay which was reported by the New York Times newspaper and an essay that I have read myself, he believes that it is lawful and constitutional for churches and schools to receive direct federal funding for all of its mission purposes and everything. He also believes in government-mandated, sponsored prayer in public schools. Okay? Even Senator John Cornyn, during the hearings, said, I have a real problem by the way students were treated in Texas when they prayed before football games. Well, that case went all the way to the Supreme Court in a case called Santa Fe School District versus George Bush, who was governor at the time. And the Supreme Court finally, it was a case that emerged in 1998, but it was a case that was decided by the Supreme Court in 2000. They investigated it. They did an interrogatory, which means a formal investigation. And they discovered that the students were organized by the school staff to do the prayers before the football games. That made it a staff-sponsored, sanctioned prayers before football games. The staff are employees of the state, okay? That made it a violation of the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. And Justice John Paul Stevens at the time, who's like 95 years old now, he's retired, but he said very clearly in his opinion, he said if the students had done it voluntarily, and if their prayer hadn't been one that says, well, believe in Jesus Christ or you're going to hell, okay? And if it didn't say that, it wasn't an evangelistic type prayer, then it would have been constitutional because it would have been voluntary. But no, what'd you hear? You heard Rush Limbaugh, you heard Lars Larson from our Portland radio, you heard Sean Hannity, you heard all these. You kids, you need to go back to your public schools and you need to protest the Supreme Court's ruling and pray before football games anyway. And yet then when they were doing it voluntarily. And it was constitutional, but they didn't bother to read that part, did they? No. It's like dumb sheep following dumb sheep. And they didn't know. They just thought, they've thrown God out of public schools again. Well, no, they didn't. They said if the kids did it voluntarily, okay, it was constitutional. Did you hear me? All right? Think about that. That's why you employ us, to help you to understand these things. Because there's so much nonsense out there. Okay? So that's what I mean by, or it's what Robert Alley means, to whatever degree a form of religious establishment, no matter how mild, enters the Constitution through the amending process, free exercise of religion is dust. I've read 6 books about Justice Scalia, including one that was just straight interviews about him, interviews with him. And I have all 6 listed right here. The Political Thought of Justice Antonin Scalia, a Hamiltonian on the Supreme Court. God forbid. But that's the way they concluded that scholar. Ralph Rossum, Antonin Scalia's Jurisprudence, Text and Tradition, okay, by Ralph Rossum. Bruce Allen Murphy, Scalia, Court of One. Joan Biskupic, American Original, The Life and Constitution of Supreme Court Antonin Justice Scalia, which is all interviews with the justice. And the other one by James Staub. In every single biography, every single one, especially the one by Joan Biskupic, which was all interviews with the justice, he brags the most, he revels in this particular instance. When he had just graduated from Harvard Law School, he decided he wanted to go to the heartland of the country instead of in Washington, D.C. and among the elitists in New York, and he went out to Cleveland, Ohio, to a law firm. Okay? And the law firm was called Jones, Day, Rivas, and Pogue in Cleveland, Ohio in 1961. That's when he started. And the law firm decided, okay, we got this new guy in the block. Let's all go to the owner of the law firm's house and let's celebrate and welcome him to the law firm. So let's have a big party. So there's this big party, and during that party, Antonin Scalia, this new lawyer, this new attorney, this law firm, took off his shoes and stood by the fireplace in his socks with wine in one hand and cheese in the other, cracker, and continued to eat crackers and drink his wine, stood by that fireplace for 6 hours arguing with his colleagues deep into the night about whether Sunday laws were constitutional or not. And he argued that Sunday laws are constitutional. And it was based upon an upcoming Supreme Court case called McCollum versus Maryland. That was before the Supreme Court that had just come in 1960. Supreme Court did rule that Sunday closing laws were constitutional. Okay? And that's what he predicted, that they would be constitutional. But he said that, you know, Sunday laws, blue laws, not only they're constitutional, but if I ever made it to the Supreme Court, again, and another case would come up, I would make sure that another precedent-setting case with different contextual factors, this was delivering the mail on Sunday, so the prohibition of it. And so he said, hey, absolutely. He says, I would rule in favor of it. And he says, that's what I would do on the Supreme Court. Well, he never got that kind of a case when he was on the Supreme Court. So it's fascinating to me how easy that we can just jump to the conclusion, we need a justice just like Justice Scalia. I saw 16 guys get up in front running for president and say, yeah, we need a justice just like Justice Scalia. Well, okay. You didn't know that. But anyway, I'll stop there. I think you get the idea. We do what we want to do. All right. Jefferson's Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom, Part 1. Again, this was Jefferson's arguments against Patrick Henry. This is actually out of an article in Liberty Magazine written by my mentor, Professor Derek Davis, who's retired chairman of the J.M. Dawson Institute of Church-State Studies at Baylor University. It's a master's and PhD program in church-state constitutional law, church-state constitutional history, and international religious freedom law. Mr. Jefferson, then retired at Monticello, noted in his autobiography that even though a majority of the legislature were churchmen, a great majority rejected an amendment put forward by those who insisted on declaring in the preamble that coercion was a departure from the plan of Jesus Christ, the holy author of our religion. In other words, they wanted to sound very pious and wanted to sound like that, yeah, they were against any form of religious pressure or coercion, and that they wanted to recognize Jesus Christ in this statement, the holy author of our religion. They wanted to somehow insert that in there, insisted. While Jefferson had no personal problem with the theological correctness of such a statement, he had a problem with Virginia declaring that it was a Christian state when in fact it was more than a state that merely tolerated other religions, but instead gave them equal status with Christians of every creed and stripe. He observed that the insertion was rejected by a great majority in proof that they meant to comprehend within the mantle of its protection the Jew, the Gentile, the Christian, and Mahometan, the Hindu and infidel of every denomination. He had been accused of being an infidel, so this was Jefferson's tongue-in-cheek reference to himself. Okay? In other words, all people of faith, including those who chose to refrain from faith altogether, were to be treated equally. This is a picture of the signing ceremony of the Oregon Workplace Religious Freedom Act that took me 10 years to pass. You can see how many religions are represented there. There's Catholics, there's Mormons, there's Baptists, there's Quakers, there's Jews, there's Muslims, there's Sikhs, there's Seventh-day Adventists. I'm right next to the governor. It was our bill. My secretary is next to me, Rhonda. Our Capitol pastor is in the back, tall guy with white hair, over to the left. That's Governor Ted Kulingoski. It was April 1, April Fool's Day, 2010. And the Speaker of the House, a powerful Speaker of the House, the Baptist, Democrat. Dave Hunt was our chief sponsor of our bill. He was the Speaker of the House of Representatives. And then Senator Brad Avakian, right behind the governor's chair there, the other guy, who was our Senate sponsor and now the Labor Commissioner for the state of Oregon. And it took me 10 years to get the religious leaders together to push for this and get it passed. It was a lot of heavy lifting. And what it does is it restores the original intent to Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 when it comes to workplace discrimination on the basis of religion. So in other words, if you ask for your Sabbath off and the employer says, no, it's an undue hardship in our business, he would have to prove under the undue hardship definition in this law that it was a significant expense to his business to accommodate you, and or it was an administrative inconvenience. Okay? Not inconvenience, but an administrative hardship. So he would have to prove that. And otherwise he'd be liable for discrimination if brought to court. And so a high burden was placed on employers to protect people of faith in the workplace, of all religious faiths, when they needed a religious accommodation in the workplace. It took us 10 years. By the way, that was the original standard in 1964 when the Civil Rights Act was passed and signed by Lyndon Johnson, the then president. And, but that was diminished in 1977 in a case before the Supreme Court called Trans World Airlines, or TWA, versus Hardison. In that decision, the Supreme Court said, employer, to meet the definition of an undue hardship, all they have to do is claim a de minimis standard. In other words, even if it's a minimal cost to our business or less than nothing. De minimis in Latin means less than nothing. And so that's all they would have to prove. And or that was an administrative inconvenience. They could wave that like a magic wand and say work or else. That's the way it is in every state in the United States still to this day, except for the states of New York, California, and Oregon. We're the three trend-setting states to try to restore the original intent of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Your state, right here in Michigan, has that really lousy standard. But they still, the employer still, okay, they're still liable if they don't prove that they went out of their way to try to accommodate you. In other words, if you can prove that the employer did nothing to try to accommodate you and was arbitrary, then your Human Rights Commission for your state would back you up, okay? And they would still be liable for discrimination. So we still get them by the hook, okay? They have to demonstrate that they went out of their way to try to accommodate you. They can't just wave that magic wand. It won't work. So we call their bluff. That's why your Religious Liberty Department is so important, so important to you. So remember that. Get your wallets and your pocketbook out and write big checks to your Religious Liberty program every fourth Sabbath of January. Don't you forget to do that. All right. That was a plug. All right. Revisiting Jefferson's Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom, Part 2. Derek Davis, retired chairman of J.M. Dawson Institute, Church State Studies at Baylor University, comments that Jefferson wrote this at a time when America was even more culturally Christian than it is today. But he argues this never meant that Virginia, let alone America, was to be Christian in any constitutional sense. The Founding Fathers at the Constitutional Convention in 1787 in Philadelphia could have easily included language in the Constitution declaring the nation to be Christian had they wanted to. In fact, many citizens argued for this kind of expressly Christian language at the state ratifying conventions after the document was presented to the states for approval. But the founders weathered these proposals, choosing to remain true to their conviction that the nation would embrace a principle of religious pluralism whereby all citizens' beliefs would be legally protected with none favored. Perhaps the most convincing proof, and this is James Madison's arguments, part one, that America's constitutional founders did not intend to establish a Christian commonwealth or nation, comes from the pens of James Madison and Thomas Jefferson. Shortly before his death, James Madison addressed the threat of a commonwealth in a September 1832 letter to the Reverend Jasper Adams, which was in response to a sermon pamphlet that Adams had circulated to key individuals, including Supreme Court Justice Joseph Story. Madison objected to the central argument in Adams' sermon, the idea that since the Christian religion was a cultural and moral force that pervaded the entire nation, it deserved to be financially supported by the government through general taxation. This, Adams argued, would solve many of the nation's moral ills. Sounds familiar today, including from one of our own in the Trump cabinet. James Madison arguments, part two. For Madison, Adams' argument was more than just a suggestion to subsidize Christian churches, but an attempt to favor Christianity in a discriminatory and thus unconstitutional manner. This ran contrary to his original understanding, particularly when the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment was largely drafted in the First Congress of 1789 on the fresh experiences of defeating Patrick Henry's funding bill, a bill originating in 1776 that would have established a provision for teachers of the Christian religion. It was defeated by a coalition of minority Protestant religions with Thomas Jefferson's bill for establishing religious freedom in Virginia, which in 1786 became Virginia's Statute of Religious Freedom and allowed for no such funding or favoritism, particularly of the Anglican Church. On Jefferson's gravestone at Monticello, if you walk down to his gravesite, which is in a big cage, and you go down there, you'll see on his big obelisk stone, you'll see that he's proud of three things, okay? Being the author of the Declaration of Independence, okay? Establishing the University of Virginia, and number three, being the author of the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom. Those are the three things. Why? Because the arguments and debates regarding the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom, and that debate winning over Patrick Henry, were the same arguments used in the House of Representatives by James Madison in 1789 in the First Congress that gave us the very language for the religion clauses of the First Amendment that you now have in your hands. Okay? In the Senate side, you will see the drafts there, and they're all non-preferential language. Well, you know, as long as, you know, no religious preference is given to any one religion, that's how those drafts read. Finally, you get to the fourth draft language, the fourth proposal, and you get in the Senate side, down at the bottom, you get almost the same language as the House version in version number 4. And the joint resolution that came from both the Senate and the House was James Madison's arguments and reasoning that came out of the experience of the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom experience in their debates against Patrick Henry and his funding assumption bill. So that language of non-preferentialism in the Senate kept getting defeated. They kept trying to bring it up, but it finally lost. And Madison's language prevailed. So therefore, today we have what? It says at the bottom, you have in the joint resolution of your sheet there, it says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Now, you want to understand the First Amendment a little bit? Let me give you a little bit of civics lesson here. When it says Congress shall make no law, ever since, well, before the Civil War amendments, that only referred to Congress. The First Amendment only applied to the federal government, okay, and federal government employees and those who worked for the federal government. okay, and it only applied to the federal government. When you get to the Civil War amendment, especially the 14th Amendment, you end up with the incorporation clause. And the incorporation clause is that, it's not the clause, but it's a doctrine that the courts came up with. And that is that both the due process clause, the privileges and immunities clause, and the equal protection clause of the 14th Amendment, meaning the entire Bill of Rights, were applicable at the state level, meaning the federal government had enforcement over the states when it came to civil rights, all right, and enforcement of it. Prior to that, the states claimed sovereignty. And so now when you read the First Amendment, when it says Congress shall make no law, Congress is a reference to all levels of government, even at the local township, even at the local school board. So Congress means all levels of government shall not make an establishment of religion. An establishment doesn't, and that key word is important because a lot of people, for example, Mike Huckabee, when he ran for president, listen to this. This is what he wrote. You ready for this? This is comical. When he was running for president in 2008, he wrote a book called From Hope to Higher Ground, My Vision for Restoring America's Greatness. And that same year, he said, I have opponents in this race who do not change the Constitution, Huckabee told a Michigan audience on Monday. But I believe it's a lot easier to change the Constitution than it would be to change the Word of the living God. And that's what we need to do, to amend the Constitution so it's in God's standards rather than to try to change God's standards so it lines up with some contemporary view. He really believed that our nation's laws should be Christian laws and should be according to God's Word, and the Constitution should be amended accordingly. Okay? Got that? And then he says in his book, he says in a text here on page 154, the First Amendment is often used illegitimately as a way to shut out the voice of faith in the public square. In some ways, I think he's right, but here's where he's wrong. He says the First Amendment declares, and here's his quote, the First Amendment, read your First Amendment. As I read this, read what it says. He says, Congress shall pass no law which respects the establishment of a specific religion or prohibits the free exercise thereof. In other words, he believes the Establishment Clause is only intended to prevent the establishment of a national church. That's it. Nothing more. How many times do you hear that? Oh yeah, we should have direct government funding, federal funding through state block grants to churches and schools. Yeah. Oh yeah, no problem. Yeah. Well, I'm sorry, that's not what it means. You see, when people say Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion, then they could rightly argue the founders only intended to prevent the establishment of a national church. No. The wording is Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. The word "an" is the root word for any. Did you get that? Congress shall make no law respecting any establishment of religion. Did you get that? It's a big difference from the, right? All right, don't let anybody fool you when I know it's an easy slip to make, but when you're citing the First Amendment, use the word "an," because it means any establishment of religion. Okay? It's very important. All right? And then prohibiting the free exercise thereof. You see, the Founding Fathers intended to, in the very wording and language of the First Amendment, you have the Establishment Clause. What does the Establishment Clause do? It prevents not only the establishment of a national church, but for state tax-supported churches or state establishment of churches. All right? It protects the separation of church and state. All right? In essence. All right? And so it protects the state from the church controlling it. You got it? From turning the state into a Puritan engine. Okay? Get what I'm saying? And the free exercise clause prevents the state, okay, from interfering in the realm or jurisdiction of the church. Right? The free exercise clause says, hey, state, you don't have a right to interfere with churches. And so when gay marriage bills come up and they threaten the free exercise of our institutions, then we have a right to be concerned, correct? That's right. That's a fact. So that's the balance. Do we want to don't go down the slippery slope of Puritanism? Do we want to go down the slippery slope of secularism that attacks religious institutions and their religious institutional autonomy that's protected by the Constitution? No, we don't want either one. All right? That's the balance. The founders understood that. That's why the very language of the religion clauses of the First Amendment are there, to prevent against that slippery slope. For Madison, Adams' argument was more than just a suggestion to subsidize Christian churches. Oh, I already read that. Let's move on. Part 3. In response to Adams, Madison wrote, "The simple question to be decided is whether a support of the best and purest religion, the Christian religion itself, ought not, so far at least as pecuniary means are involving money, to be provided for by the government, rather than be left to the voluntary provisions of those who profess it." Madison's rhetorical question had a quick and decisive answer. This was his response to Adams. "On this question, experience will be an admitted umpire," he said. "In the papal system, government and religion are in a manner consolidated, and that is found to be the worst of governments." Did you get that? Madison argued that this was because history had proven that such a system had neither been favorable to religion or to government. And so we need not go down that road. Benjamin Franklin's observation, here's what he wrote. "When a religion is good, I conceive that it will support itself. And when it cannot support itself and God does not take care to support so that its professors are obliged to call for the help of the civil power, it is a sign, I apprehend, of its being a bad one." Pretty logical, huh? I like that guy. He's pretty smart, huh? I like him. Well, again, James Madison's Memorial and Remonstrance at closer look. Again, number 8, if religion be not within the cognizance of civil government, how can its legal establishment be necessary to civil government? What influence, in fact, have ecclesiastical establishments had on civil society? In some instances, they have been seen to erect a spiritual tyranny on the ruins of the civil authority. In many instances, they have been seen upholding the thrones of political tyranny. In no instance have they been seen the guardians of the liberties of the people. Then notice this in his Remonstrance number 3. "Who does not see that the same authority which can establish Christianity in exclusion of all other religions may establish with the same ease any particular sect of Christians in exclusion of all other sects?" Think about that. "That the same authority which can force a citizen to contribute 3 pence only of his property for the support of any one establishment may force him to conform to any other establishment in all cases whatsoever." In other words, if you start to establish Christianity over all of the religions, then what's going to happen? The most powerful Christian churches are then going to discriminate against minority faiths. "Oh, yeah, they don't quite measure up. We don't agree with them. You know, they're outcasts. No, they don't get anything. Yeah, and we're gonna persecute them too. I mean, we're tired of them." Okay, that's where you go with all that. You start going down the road of degrees. Who's worthy? Who's not? Right? That's bad news. So, when you look at Madison's and Henry's arguments, Madison had a point. Here's what he wrote in his Memorial and Remonstrance. "Look, Christian, how comfortable are you that Henry would have the government provide tax support to ministers in order to achieve purely temporal or political goals? Are you comfortable with that?" Madison's appeal, however, was more than one directional, because he argued in Memorial and Remonstrance number 8 that the lessons of history demonstrate that for the state to financially aid the church was to empower the church to advise, influence, and direct the state. That's what a so-called church-state united resulted in, an unworkable cabal or conspiracy in a democratic constitutional system. Madison understood this. Patrick Henry did not. But today, Henry is winning. How is he winning? May 1st, this year, something was handed to us in an executive order. All right? And this type of executive order has been signed before by previous presidents. George W. Bush, who brought us faith-based executive orders and faith-based initiatives. And then Obama, same thing. But there's a huge difference. May 1st executive order restores a Bush-era initiative that allows religious groups to be more involved in providing federally funded social services. But more importantly, in the name of religious liberty, it repeals Obama administration rules that limited the ability of religious groups to use federal funds to proselytize or preach to those they served. Did you get that? This potentially crosses a constitutional line that violates the Establishment Clause provision separating church and state. The Trump order obliterates the rule that faith-based groups were required to abide by in referring beneficiaries to alternative programs if they objected to religious teachings while receiving services. In other words, this order says, yeah, you not only can receive all the money you want, you charitable organizations, you faith-based charitable organizations, but while you're providing services, charitable services, you can use this federal money to preach, to indoctrinate, to evangelize, do anything you want. There you go. So that's direct government funding of religious entities. All right? Now, there are the previous federal and state regulations I'm going to outline here. But, you know, there's a familiar axiom, at least in the legislatures that I work at, and working directly with state legislators day in and day out. He who owns the gold makes the rules. If they've got the money and you're receiving money from them, they can regulate you, right? All right, but there's a reverse to that. We'll get to it in a minute. But basically, these are the rules. Okay, this is the way they've been in the past until this executive order by the current president. Faith-based organizations are eligible to participate in federally administered social service programs to the same degree as any other group, although certain restrictions on FBOs or faith-based organizations that accept government funding have been created by the White House to avoid violations of the Establishment Clause. They may not use direct government funds to support inherently religious activities such as prayer, worship, religious instruction, or proselytization. Any inherently religious activities that the organizations may be offered separately in time or location from services that receive federal assistance. Faith-based organizations cannot discriminate on the basis of religion when providing services. This is from the GAO 2006, Section 13, Code 3. What regulatory power, I ask, and this is the very question I asked to John DiIulio Jr. at the Red Lion Hotel in the Quay, Red Lion Inn at the Quay in Vancouver, Washington. It was a group of audience of about 4,000 or 5,000 teachers and heads of faith-based organizations and churches and everything. And so they had all these round tables out there. It was a huge, huge auditorium. And they had microphones set in different places. That microphone, I'm telling you, my chair was right here, my round table was behind me, and it was sitting right in front of me. So I decided, you know, that was a God thing. I better get up and say something, and I was scared to death. But you may not think so. You may laugh at that. But believe me, I'm shyer than you think I am. So anyway, I went to the microphone. And after his lecture, representing the Bush administration, he was the czar for faith-based initiatives, appointed by George W. Bush. I went to the microphone and asked about how such social service assistance would be regulated based upon the above list of restrictions that I just read to you. Okay, these restrictions, all right? I said, do you guys have the manpower to regulate all that? I said, realistically, how much are you really going to regulate? Are you going to be inspecting everybody as to whether they're trying to indoctrinate someone while receiving social services? I said, how in the world are you going to regulate that? And he said, his answer was, that was a problem. He said before a crowd of 2,000 charitable organization leaders that was a problem and that the ability of the federal government to regulate the use of such funds was a difficult task. Okay? Mr. DiIulio later became a critic of the program and left the Bush White House Office of Faith-Based Community-Based and Community Initiatives in protest. Not because of my question, but because of some politics. But here's James Madison's reasoning revisited, that the lessons of history demonstrate that for the state to financially aid the church was to empower the church to advise influence, and direct the state. Imagine the political hue and cry of religious charitable organizations in the wider political community if such a regulatory power was actually carried out in a serious manner. They think the Inquisition was in hand. We're being persecuted. You're constantly trying to regulate our use of those monies. Can't you hear the hue and cry on Fox News? Can't you hear the hue and cry on any other radio talk show? Yeah, you would. It would prove to be a no-win situation. This is what Madison warned against. It empowers religious organizations to direct and possibly over time control the state. Let me give you another historical example, and this is a very important one. How many of you have heard of the Emperor Charlemagne? Anybody heard that? Yeah. Going back to the Dark Ages, all right? The Holy Roman Christian Emperor, all right? He had a tutor named Alcuin from England. He was a bishop or a priest or whatever, and he was there to tutor him because he was illiterate, all right? And one day, it was Christmas Day, 800 AD, he decided to go worship at St. John's Lateran Cathedral in Rome. And as he was kneeling and saying his prayers, Pope Leo II comes out and crowns him like he did his father, okay, Pepin III. And King Pepin III. And that started a tradition whereby the Vatican, it was called the investiture struggle, or the struggle over who had the right to ordain who. Was it the right of bishops or popes to ordain the king and give them the scepter? Okay? Or was the right of kings to designate cardinals and bishops throughout the realm and to be approved by the state or the emperor? Okay? Who had the right to ordain who? That was always the investiture controversy. Who had the right to invest or ordain who? And that's still being carried out. That was a struggle recently in China. You've been following the news. In China, does the communist state, are they the ones in charge appointing their own Catholic bishops and approve Catholic bishops? That's been the struggle between the Holy See or the Pope and the Chinese communist leaders. That's been in the news for the last 10 years. Yeah, well, they finally reached a compromise, and they said, yeah, go ahead. You can go ahead and prove your own. We have our own. We have no problem. Go ahead. So the Vatican just caved and gave in, just with this Pope Francis, and said, yeah, that's all right, fine. And of course, the conservative Catholic cardinals are pretty upset about that right now. And so are some of the conservative faithful, but which is a minority in the Catholic Church, but nevertheless, they're upset, and they're a force to be reckoned with. But Charlemagne, you know, after that coronation, he said, you know, I'm pretty upset about that. Is the church proposing that they're going to control me, that I have to answer to them in every dictate? Well, guess what? I'm going to show the church who's in charge. And what did he do? He did something that was really, forgive the expression, dumb and dumber. He really did. He thought, I'm going to show the church. I'm going to show the Pope who's boss. And you know what he started doing? He started appointing bishops and priests to be head of munitions, to be feudal lords, to be mayors, to be head of battalions, to be heads of different parts of the state throughout the empire. And pretty soon, the church became the state. Get it? The church became the state. How ridiculous is that? Well, it's sort of the same proposal here. The more influence you give to people of faith, us at the political table, oh, we have a place at the political table, and we're receiving all this money to solve all the social and moral ills in the country. And by the way, we can do a whole lot more for you. The state, Mr. President, Mr. Governor, Mr. Representative, Mr. Senator, Honorable Senator, you know, there's so much more we could do for you if we just only had the money, you know. And by getting that money, they become more and more powerful and influential in terms of advising and even controlling. See, I think that that rule of thumb, that he who owns the gold makes the rules, actually reverses itself. Okay? I believe James Madison was correct, more correct, that the lessons of history demonstrate that for the state to financially aid the church was to empower the church to advise, influence, and direct the state. Did you get that? So, it empowers religious organizations to direct and possibly over time control the state. Today's tug of war is really not too hard to discern if you pay closer attention to it. Today there are powerful forces that threaten both the establishment and free exercise clauses of the First Amendment. Government neutrality means religion and religious institutions must be allowed to thrive freely, but without its official endorsement through direct financial support, government-sponsored school prayers, or by overt means of symbolic messaging via Ten Commandment or nativity displays. The First Amendment in part states, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Today, many conservative evangelicals and Catholics seek to interpret the No Establishment Clause provision separating church and state in ways that would require government to financially support their institutions and enforce their dogmas with the intent of solving the moral ills of the nation. Led by constitutional and historical revisionist David Barton, who's on your screen here, there is a movement afoot called Project Blitz that seeks to overwhelm and influence state legislatures to introduce and pass bills that will eventually overthrow the constitutional separation of church and state and certain aspects of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, which they see as the central impediments to be removed in their fight against, number one, the restriction of direct government funding of religious institutions, two, free speech restrictions on faith-based organizations that receive funding for charitable social work, and three, equal constitutional protections for women, ethnic minorities, and same-sex people. Establishing the United States as a Christian nation by law is their main goal, to restore what they perceive to be the good old days, the good old boy days. No, thank you. Part three, today's tug of war. Admittedly, there is a tug of war going on. This is because in recent years, the secular left has regularly sought to marginalize the free exercise of religion by failing to recognize that government must have a sufficient, compelling interest when lawfully denying or restricting the constitutional right of individuals and institutions of faith to exercise and maintain their religious mission and practices. This has been manifested by attempts to defeat state religious freedom restoration acts that ensure the right of institutions to hire only those who meet their mission standards and purposes, and ensure that business owners and employees are not forced to violate their conscience and their rights to free speech. The recent U.S. Supreme Court ruling in the Masterpiece Cake situation highlights this war over whose equally guaranteed rights will prevail. I was at the U.S. Supreme Court when that decision was handed down on July 1st, and I was at my annual I belong to the Supreme Court Historical Society, and they have an annual banquet, black tie dinner, where I get to meet some of the justices, talk to them, and talk to a number of leading scholars there, and so on, including retired Supreme Court justices, or not, state Supreme Court justices and other people, if I'm lucky enough to sit at their table. And I have been on a regular basis, and it's been a lot of fun to mingle with some of these. I got to meet, this time, Justice Clarence Thomas, which was fascinating. He came up, I shook my hands, told him what I did. He said, that's great. And by the time I did that, there was a whole gaggle of people around him, about 12 people. And he started to pontificate how he disagreed with the actual decision that he ruled upon. Wasn't a majority opinion, but the Masterpiece Cake decision that was just handed down that very day, and said, yes, I was in the majority ruling on that, but he says, I totally disagree with the doctrinal outcome of it, okay? He said that was such a narrow ruling that basically said that, yeah, because the Masterpiece Cake baker, his whole mission was to put religious messages on his cakes, he had a sincerely held religious belief. Okay? So the Supreme Court basically was saying that unless you have a sincerely held religious belief, you cannot deny people their constitutional right, their civil rights, to have a cake baked for them. Okay? In other words, if you're a baker that, like the baker in Oregon, who all of a sudden decided to have a conscience and refused the same-sex couple to the baking of a cake, even though they didn't ask for any images or anything or religious message or anything, just refused it and say, hey, well, I'm sorry, our conscience says we can't, they're going to be held liable because they didn't prove that they had a sincerely held religious belief by their routine practices in their business demonstrating such. That's basically the way the Masterpiece Cakes decision was handed down, whether you like it or whether you don't. It was a Pyrrhic victory for people of faith, but only if now cake bakers all of a sudden decide to put only religious messaging on their cakes, all of them. Guess what? That limits their audience. That limits their business. They could easily go out of business. Their clientele is going to be a small group of people because the vast majority of people are not religious. It's a fact. And so their businesses are going to suffer. Is that the fault of the courts? No. No, it just means that the standard that was ruled on by the Supreme Court is that you have to have a sincerely held religious belief and you need to prove and demonstrate it. Okay? If you don't, and you don't demonstrate it by your routine practice of how you pump out wedding cakes, could cause you to be liable for discrimination. Okay? It's that simple. And personally, I agree with the decision. Okay? A lot of people thought this was a great victory for people of faith. It wasn't. It wasn't at all. Just the opposite. It only favored that one cake baker, okay, who had a religious mission and proved it. And now it's coming back to haunt him because now even the 10th Circuit Court, the Federal Circuit Court, is questioning whether that person really is doing that, or did he just start doing that and didn't do it all along. So now they're questioning whether, so it's a big problem out there. But the point is this: the secular left has been, in recent years, hostile to people of faith. And that's caused the pendulum to swing. And so that's why we're seeing the reaction that we're seeing now. And it will continue that way. If the left pushes too hard, you're going to get a very powerful right-wing swing that will at first appear to provide a corrected balance, but then go too far. And then we head towards a fascist state, controlled by religious powers, which Ellen White warned against in terms of the prophetic, the rise of the prophetic image to the beast. So, both forces, I argue, are harmful to our constitutional health, and yet the nation's founders anticipated this severe tension. That is why they created an internal check and balance within the very wording of the First Amendment to prevent the country from being overrun by either extreme in the great church-state debate, a puritanical versus godless society. Remove this balancing safeguard and our nation's constitutional guarantees will be lost, and with it our civil and religious freedoms. Sandra Day O'Connor, in a speech before the University of Ireland years ago, summed it up best. The religious zealot and the theocrat frighten us in part because we understand only too well their basic impulse. No less frightening is the totalitarian atheist who aspires to a society in which the exercise of religion has no place. Any questions? I know it was long, but I'm done. Yeah.
You spoke a lot about the federal funding of religious institutions.
Yes.
And I can't really ignore about the dangers of that. But what do you think about tax exemptions for churches? In my recent estimate, is that not federal funding of our institutions? And does that not cause a problem for us because we are, in order to stay within our tax exempt status, we can't say or do things, maybe in the future, do things that we can't say or do without risking.
That's a good question. Yeah, there was a case called Texas Monthly Magazine versus Bullock in 1987. And in that Supreme Court decision, the Supreme Court said that, you know, if we were to lift the tax-exempt status from religious institutions, we would so hurt these charitable organizations. And the argument is, and this is the argument for faith-based initiatives, is, and this is the reason why President Bush basically won his argument that they're constitutional. Okay, the Supreme Court has ruled that they're constitutional, in the sense that they basically allow charitable organizations to advise the president, but it doesn't necessarily allow them to use that money while providing services and proselytizing at the same time. They can't do that. That's why those regulations are in place. But they still can receive the monies. So in the same way, in regard to tax-exempt status, if you were to deprive our church from tax-exempt status, or our schools, or our hospitals, or anybody else, all right, what you would do is you would terribly hurt them, and you would hurt society. Basically, most charitable social services, 90% of it's provided by religious organizations, not by the state. So the state would be shooting itself in the foot. So of course they're going to give us a tax-exempt status. Now, Americans United for Separation of Church and State, an organization I agree with them on some things, okay, they're misguided in trying to strip all churches of state tax exemption and denominations of tax exemption. It's ridiculous. It would cripple us. We're already crippled enough. I mean, our people aren't giving because our old people are dying off. The World War II generation that was very systematic in giving, they're dying off. Young people giving, what is that? You know, and so that's where we're at as a church. We're financially really hurting, okay? We're hurting because the young people aren't with us. We've lost the young people, all right? So, man, if the Americans United ever get their way, it's going to kill us big time. We're already hurting from the executive order that Trump signed regarding parsonage allowance, parsonage exemption. All right, I as a pastor, I cannot write off my office space at home, or the use of my car, or anything else. I mean, I'm losing money big time. I'm not getting that money back. All right, so pastors, and the reason being is because the people who have given us a bad name are these mega church pastors and these people that say, well, I'm going to die unless you give me $1 million, and everybody gives them their $1 million, and they become super wealthy rich. Or the guy that was on the, what was it, a commercial that, well, you know, God's going to take me to heaven unless you give me so much money. And by the way, I need to raise money for this. I need a new Learjet. You remember that? Came out about 6 months ago. Some guy down in Houston, some megachurch pastor. Yeah, people sent him millions of bucks, and he got his new jet. Wow. Oh, my friends, I'm telling you, those are the type of people that give us a bad name, and it's sad. So my answer is that the Supreme Court decided that it was best for society, best for the country, to leave well enough alone and to allow tax-exempt status to be constitutional. So there's precedent for that. So that's what Americans United is trying to overturn. So we would fight that as a church. Yes?
I believe that Jesus is the Jehovah of the Old Testament Lord. I don't see him joining the party in Sodom and Gomorrah.
Yeah, I don't either. I don't think he joins either one. Yeah. In fact, Desire of Ages, page 509, said that, let me look it up for you. It's right here. You make a very good comment. Here's what he said. Which kind of, it's interesting that even Ellen White's writing this, because Ellen White was probably the most politically active person there was. She said there is a time and a place to stand up, but here's what she says in Desire of Ages, page 509, just to read it to you. It's very important. She says, the government under which Jesus lived was corrupt and oppressive. On every hand were crying abuses, extortion, intolerance, and grinding cruelty. Yet the Savior attempted no civil reforms. He attacked no national abuses, nor condemned the national enemies. He did not interfere with the authority or administration of those in power. He who was our example kept aloof from earthly governments, not because he was indifferent to the woes of men, but because the remedy did not lie in merely human and external measures. To be efficient, the cure must reach into men individually and must regenerate the heart. Yeah, you're right. I don't think Jesus would be in favor of secular humanism, but nevertheless, he would be in favor of making secular humanists inclusive in part of his ministry, to reach out to them. Yeah. Okay. All right. Anybody else? Yeah. Yes, sir.
I have heard it from a lawyer, and it seems to be a trend. Basically, this country has a constitution, but it really doesn't, because the courts just kind of blow off the constitution. Federal courts, circuit courts.
How so?
Your rights, we have no rights.
How so? You're generalizing.
We have certain freedoms we're supposed to have,
Okay?
but yet they tell you what you can have on your property, what you can't have on your property. I was told that I have too much firewood on my property, and yet nobody can see it on 6.5 acres from the road, only from the sky.
Are you part of a neighborhood association?
No.
Oh, okay.
So,
Well, is there a city ordinance? You sure?
the thing is, they can write whatever they want to write and go against you whenever they want.
He lives outside the city, not
So you're in the county. So there's county ordinances.
County, township, but still, it's not on their books, but I've seen them write stuff whenever they want to change something.
Well, and yes, there's certain broad latitude for that. And your trial courts at the trial court level, and this, I'm going to tell you how the court system works. You want to know how it works? All right. And this will be quick. It's not that hard to understand. Trial courts tend to uphold individual rights and human rights, and then it usually goes up on appeal by the county or the township or the city to the state appeals court. The appeals court job is to uphold local ordinances, okay? And so they tend to reverse and side with the county or the city or the township. Then, when it goes to the Supreme Court has to look, the state Supreme Court that is, has to look over their shoulders to the U.S. Supreme Court and federal courts, who say, okay, we have certain precedents in these areas, and we tend to uphold individual rights more than city, county, state ordinances, unless the court is controlled by conservatives, which then they rule, again, in favor of local, county, city, and state and township ordinances. All right, so if they're liberal, they tend to uphold the individual right over states' rights or the rights or the ordinances of, again, city, county, and township. It's kind of the way it works. It's almost predictable. When I watch these cases get appealed, I almost know where it's going. There are exceptions to the rule, and there's always surprises along the way, but that's generally how it works. So in your case, you're right. The trial level courts at the state level, which involves looking at county ordinances or city ordinances or township, they will give broad latitude for those to make up the rules as they go, as they see fit, for whatever's good for the community, quote unquote. But then if you push against that and actually sue them, okay, you have a good chance of winning at a trial court level. But then that county will then appeal, and it will go to the state Supreme Court, and they'll reverse your victory. They'll reverse your victory. But then if you appealed yourself upon losing to the state Supreme Court, you'd have a 50-50% chance. I'm going to give you an example. When our new Union Conference building was being built, before we could build, the Clark County in Vancouver, Washington area, just north, across the Columbia River, north of Portland, Oregon there, said that they didn't want us to build there on the property that we owned because we didn't meet their definition of a church. Okay? Their definition of a church is that you met for services for 1 hour on Sunday, and that's it. That was their old definition. It was outdated, ridiculous, but, you know, Catholic Church backed it 100%, and almost everybody that served on the Clark County Council were Catholic. And so they opposed us building there. And No wonder, because right across from all the hayfields where our building is built is a very significant, very wealthy, but tiny Catholic cathedral there that has a lot of influence in Clark County. So we got blocked by the county, so we appealed to the trial court, took it to court, and we won. And then Dave Duncan, who was our attorney at the time at the Union Conference, and myself said that we'll probably get reversed at the state appeals court. I mean, we brought in the General Conference attorney, Mitch Tyner. We brought in, all kinds of big guns, and they advised the attorney that the Union Conference had hired in Portland that dealt with these things, and who died 3 months later of a heart attack, by the way. But he took it to the appeals court, to three judge court, and it was reversed. And so we predicted that would happen. It was logical. And then I appealed to our leaders to appeal our loss to the state Supreme Court, because they had the, what's that called? The Religious Institutions and, RLUIPA, religious, that's terrible. Anyway, the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act of 2000, which Bill Clinton signed, the president. And that law specifically was a law that allowed for basically more broad latitude of churches to build. And so what happened was, I said to Mitch Tyner and others, hey, if we appeal this up to the state Supreme Court in Washington, they have to look over their shoulder to federal law. I said, this looks like a slam dunk. And we'd help all the churches in Clark County who are really mad against Clark County. And we'd be the real champions of religious freedom here. We have a really good opportunity to do that. Instead, they took the easy route, which was to Ridgefield. The city of Ridgefield says, well, we're going to annex you into our city limits right there. So they annexed us, and that was an easy fix. But in the meantime, there was no religious liberty victory for anybody else. So I was a little upset with that. I was kind of fussing over that. But basically, I think we would have won at the state Supreme Court level very easily, because they had to look at federal precedents. So that's kind of the way it works. I'm sorry about your situation, but it's I don't know if that helps you. But is there any other questions? Yes. Well, it's very simple. Look at their track record. I mean, for me, I investigate pretty thoroughly. How do you know? It's kind of hard with some. It's true. Look who they tack to. I mean, I'll just be quite frank. If they tack to Donald Trump, they tack to the Christian right. If they are for basically government sponsorship of prayer in public schools, ask them. Find out. Inquire. Make inquiries. Don't be afraid to ask. Don't be afraid to speak up. If they're for direct government funding of private religious schools like Ben Carson is, ask yourself, is that really what we believe in as a church? No, it's not. Okay? Be honest with yourself. Be honest with the counsel we've been given. It's very clear, and with history and constitutional history. Ask yourself these things. Be honest with yourself. Don't tack back to what your church says you should do. In other words, let me say this. Not your church officially. There's a difference between the church that represents the cultural community and peer pressure, and then the official church. I represent the official church. But every local church has its own culture, and that culture pretty much rules everything. That's what Paul wrote so strenuously about. You, my fellow Christians, that you've just been converted, you're controlled by your culture. You're not really that converted. Okay? He was constantly railing against that. He was saying, don't let your culture guide you into how you think and believe and how you act. Okay? Don't let peer pressures determine which way you go. Don't let that control you. And so many times we do. We're saying the right thing because the majority believes that in our church. Okay? Don't be afraid to go against the grain if it's right. Okay? If you're convicted it's right. If you're not, then don't. That's fine. That's your individual conscience. So that's, how do you know? It reminds me of a statement in Gospel Workers. I forget which pages. I think it's 392, 393, or 388 to 389, where people misuse these quotes so easily. They said, well, Ellen White says we shouldn't vote. Really? She says we should not adhere to any political party. Okay? We should be independent. She didn't say don't vote. In fact, she goes on to point out that our vote should be careful. She believed very much in voting, but to be careful how you vote, lest we put people into office that oppress religious freedom. And if we do, then we're what? Responsible for the sins they commit while in office. Okay? That's very ominous. You say, oh, well, then I should just not vote altogether. I don't want to be accountable for anyone's sins. Okay? Yeah, that's an easy conclusion to make. But whether it's Bill Clinton or Donald Trump or whoever, the bottom line is, of course, I heard that Barack Obama was the most immoral man who ever occupied the presidency. I'm going, really? My goodness. Compared to who? I just shake my head in disbelief. I just can't believe that reasoning. You may not like him politically, that's fine. But, I mean, the irrational arguments I hear all the time just amaze me. I mean, a model family, the Obama family. Very model family, in very respectable sense. Fantastic. I wish we had more like that, to be honest with you. Same thing with Jimmy Carter. My goodness, what a godly man. He was treated so badly as a president. I'm a Republican. I'll just be honest with you. I'm a Lincoln Republican. I've told you that already. I've been a registered Republican my whole life. But, and I'm very conservative in my foreign policy. And I'm very conservative on economics. But, man, when it comes to certain things, I have a real hard time. I'm very pro-civil rights and pro-separation of church and state. So, I don't know, you can model whoever you want to model after, but that's my standards. And I'm very much of a Abraham Lincoln person who stood up for civil rights because it was right. Here's a simple answer. Stand up and vote for what's right because it is right. Don't worry about anybody else. It doesn't matter what anybody else thinks about how you vote or what you think in the church. Everybody has a right to their own free expression. Ellen White did say, hey, don't be so vociferous about your political opinions. That's true, but that doesn't mean she wasn't politically active for righteous causes. All right? So determine what those are for you and go for it. That's my philosophy. Don't judge me and I won't judge you. But I'm going to speak up because I'm a religious liberty leader for my union. So that's my job. Like I said, I'm not going to make everybody happy, but I have my viewpoint. So it's the best I can do. And you should do your best. And let nobody judge you for it because it's none of their business. So, okay? That's the way to look at it. Your politics is none of my business, and my politics is none of your business. But we can listen and learn from one another, can't we? We can inquire, we can have a discussion, especially if it involves last day events or the life of Christ. And I would prefer that you'd look at it from the life of Christ, like this morning. Read the 4 Gospels. Read about the landmines. It's not just, we've thought, oh, these warm, fuzzy promises. Oh, Jesus makes me feel so cuddly and warm. I mean, I'm not trying to make fun of anybody here, but I'm trying to tell you that when we look at Jesus, he had to navigate the social, the political, the cultural, the religious, the theological landmines of his day. They were huge. And we avoid all those. We don't bother to look at the serious nature of what Christ had to deal with during his time. They give us answers to how we should navigate today. That's why we must study the life of Christ like never before and pray deeply. That's my prayer for you. Shall we call it quits? All right. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you so much for this wonderful opportunity to share in a faraway state for me, Michigan. Bless these folks in a special way. Bless the Warren Seventh-day Adventist Church. Bless the pastor and his wife and son in a tremendous way. Lord, may your Holy Spirit be poured upon them. May it be poured on this community. May, again, this church shine like a city on a hill. And may each one here be so wedded to your word and so inspired and enthused and on fire for you that the work will be finished quickly in this part of the world. And Lord, I pray that you be with our country, be with its leaders. Lord, miracles do happen. Nebuchadnezzar was converted. Anything's possible. And I just pray that you would be with our leaders, that we would pray for them, and that we would be wise in who we elect at all times. And Lord, I pray that we would elect those who would defend religious freedom and the separation of church and state in such a way that gives us more time to win souls for you. May that be our prayer. In Jesus' name, amen. Oh, if you want business cards, I have business cards. If you want to write me, I got a bunch of business cards.